Thank you, Eric. Good afternoon, everyone here and who's also with us online. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our 2022 Hauptmann lecture speaker, Dr. David Kang. When I came to Park in 2017, I was immediately struck by the gravity of this event, both who it's named for and the prestigious speakers it's hosted over the years, and Dr. Kang is no exception. Dr. Kang is the Mary Crutcher Professor of International Relations, as well as Professor of Business and East Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Southern California. He completed his undergraduate studies at Stanford before completing his PhD at UC Berkeley. A colleague I spoke to about my excitement following Dr. Kang's agreeing to give this talk called him a contrarian in the best possible sense of the word. His work does not just question orthodoxy, but subjects it to rigorous analysis, often expanding the field of international relations beyond its Eurocentric focus in the process. His 7 books and 33 scholarly articles, not to mention a long list of other publications, have covered corruption in South Korea and the Philippines, North Korean nuclear politics, the emergence of the state in East Asia, U.S. grand strategy in Asia, as well as a forthcoming book on power transition and international order. Throughout all of this work, you can see a commitment to expanding our broad historical foundation and building out IR's ability to critique contemporary international politics. I look forward to his thoughts today and from learning from him along with you. Without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Kang to Park University.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction. It's really great to be here. I appreciate the invitation. I'm delighted to be here for the first time in Kansas City, or Parkville, I guess. And I just want to say, I often get introduced as a contrarian. Every time I do something, I'll do like a briefing at the, for somewhere in the military, and let's say, now for an alternative view. And I say, I'm not that contrarian. I'm not a hippie. I'm wearing a tie, right? So it's not that contrarian, right? And it's an honor to be invited here, because some of the speakers that you've had before are truly titans of international relations, like Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer, right? And in a lot of ways, I'm not famous like them. What I do know is I know Asia really well. And so what I'm going to do is try and talk to you about U.S. China right now, which appears to be getting a little bit worse. And so just out of curiosity first, has anybody been to China? Okay, yeah. Japan, anywhere in Asia? Japan? Cool. BTS, anyone to BTS? Okay, right. In my day, I never thought it'd be known, right? So here are the questions that we're asking ourselves a lot today. Is China a threat? Is war likely between the U.S. and China? And I'm here to tell you, no, it is not. No, it is not a threat. We have to live with China, and we have to figure out how. But if we manage relations well, war should not be is distant anyway, right? So I'm gonna make one observation, and then I'm gonna make one argument in 45 minutes or so, and then I'm happy to talk. Love to Q&A about whatever you guys want to talk about, because there's so much on the table. And my observation is this: East Asia today is more peaceful and more stable and more integrated than at any time in the last 50 years. Any time in the last 100 years. It's getting more peaceful, not less. And my argument is, U.S. policy to the region should be focused on business and diplomacy and not the military. So that's the argument I'm going to give you. But first I'm going to try and describe the region, because so often we don't know. Everybody just sort of assumes China wants to dominate the world, China's big, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about what the region has looked like over the last 100 years and why we are where we are today and the issues that China cares about. And I'm going to argue that what China wants is not growing and has been around for 100 years. The things they care about today are obviously the same things they cared about in 1875. And it's not getting bigger, even as they get more powerful. And then I'm going to argue that the United States is trying to figure out how we live with China. What are we going to do? And that if we get it right, both sides can benefit. And if we get it wrong, things can go bad. But I don't think we are in as much danger as we might think. So first, interestingly enough, China and the United States in some ways are more similar than different. Both are continent-sized countries that started on a populated, urbanized East Coast and expanded westward into large frontier zones that were empty or annihilating or incorporating the indigenous peoples that were there. Right? They're both continent-sized, huge countries that have a civilizational view of themselves. There's very few countries in the world that are like that. How they're different is that about 2,000 years ago, there were a number of empires. There was Rome, Egypt, Aztecs, Incas, Persia. All of those empires are gone. There was a Han Empire, and China today is recognizably derived from that 2,000 years ago. And in fact, China's not rising today. China's returning to a position of centrality in the region. And so what do I mean by that, right? 100 years ago, 150 years ago, and it's now getting to be like 150 years ago, there was an old East Asian order where China was at the center and had been at the center of this region for centuries. And there were kingdoms that are recognizably the same today. Germany 150 years ago was not Germany. Germany was a bunch of little states that Bismarck unified in the mid-19th century. Italy wasn't Italy 150 years ago, but Korea was Korea centuries ago. Japan, Vietnam, these are recognizably the same countries that had centuries-long relations with this thing called China. About 1850 or so, Western imperial powers showed up. The world changed. All the old ways of doing things fell apart in East Asia. And one of the funny things is you can look for like Chinese, Japanese, Korean leaders, and in 1850 they're still dressed in their pajamas. They're still dressed in the traditional garb. And then the same guy 20 years later has a mustache and medals and a sword. They said, this isn't how we do IR. This is how we do IR. And that led to a century of chaos in East Asia. The Dutch conquered Indonesia, colonized Indonesia, imperialism. The French got Vietnam, Southeast Asia, Laos. The British, of course, had India, Burma, Malaysia, across. Spain had the Philippines. All the old way in which East Asia interacted with each other fell apart. And then followed a century of war. Essentially, Japan then colonized, it took part of China, took Taiwan, then conquered Korea, then decided to invade all of China. There were wars of independence throughout Southeast Asia. The Vietnamese were fighting against the French from the 1920s. They eventually bumped into the United States, so World War II. I saw the Nisei exhibit, by the way. That's really impressive, what Park University did for the Japanese students during World War II. Right? Massive war throughout the entire region. And then after there, Chinese Civil War, Korean Civil War, Vietnamese Civil War. So 100 years ago, you go back to 1922, 50 years ago, roughly, the mid-1970s, there's still extraordinary violence throughout the region. The last real war of conquest or real war of civil war ended in 1975 with the unification of Vietnam. Then there was one border war in 1979, and there's a real inflection point in the mid-1970s. Since that time, there hasn't been a major war in East Asia. There hasn't even been anything close to a border skirmish. There might have been one between India and China, but this was not massive mobilizations of divisions, tank divisions, and land invasions, things like that we're seeing in Ukraine right now. These countries are newly independent. They are now stabilized over 50 years. The amount of economic growth that we know in East Asia is phenomenal. I mean, I'm speeding through these things just so that we can keep moving on. But compared to someone who was born in 1975, if you're born in 1975 or afterwards, the world in East Asia looks way more safe and stable than it did if you were born in, say, 1950 or so. And it's important that we have that type of a baseline for trying to understand China. It is measurably more stable today than it was before. There's only two countries that fear for their survival right now in East Asia. Anybody? North Korea and Taiwan, right? And we're going to talk. I'm happy to talk about North Korea as much as you want, but I'm really here to talk about China, right? That's super interesting. But and I'll talk more about Taiwan, right? There's only two countries, whereas if you go back to 1950 or 1970, almost every country was under threat of invasion or in the middle of an actual war. So the region is way more stable than it was, and it is way richer. My joke about BTS is a joke, but the fact that people in Missouri know a Korean pop group is unthinkable when I was a kid. And yet here we are. So we need to start with that as a baseline. And within that baseline, let's look at what China went through. Taiwan was taken, Hong Kong, the British took Hong Kong, the Portuguese took Macau in the 1850s or so. War, the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911, warlords, civil war, a communist party and a nationalist party fighting. They both briefly stopped, not briefly, between 1931 and 1945, both the Chinese sides stopped and fought off the Japanese in a horrifically brutal war that went throughout China. And then the minute the Japanese surrendered in 1945, communists and KMT turned around and started fighting each other again. KMT lost, they fled to Taiwan, the Chinese Communist Party is there, and then began a period of chaotic rule under Mao Zedong. A famine that killed 20 million people in the late 1950s, the Cultural Revolution in the mid-1960s, where thousands of people were killed and lives were uprooted. So China was a poor, largely inward-focused country up until 1978. Again, right around that inflection point when Deng Xiaoping, then the current leader of China, said, "To get rich is glorious," and they started a capitalist opening that has resulted in where we are today. Nobody predicted in 1978 or even 1999 that China would continue to be as big as it is today. But here we are. China is so rich and so much more stable today than it was if you were born in 1978 or during the Cultural Revolution. And that is where we are today. Which has led to questions of what is going to happen with this massive country that is now second in terms of size to the United States in terms of economy. What is going to happen? How are we going to get along? The United States is trying to figure out what's going to happen. But what does China want? Because we have theorists like Stephen Waltz or John Mearsheimer who say that all countries, as they get bigger, have rising ambitions and rising, want to do more. So it's taken as an article of faith in D.C. People just simply assert China wants world domination. They want to knock us off from being a leader. They want to conquer the world. So now I'm going to talk about what does China want. And I'm going to argue that what China wants is not new and is not expanding. And here's what I mean. I really like this idea, and I'm still fooling around, but what China wants is it has transdynastic goals. What China wants today, what the People's Republic of China wants today, PRC, is not new to the Communist Party. They didn't come up with these things they care about. Almost every issue that China explicitly talks about became an issue under the Qing dynasty in the 1850s or the 1870s. Hong Kong, Macau, Xinjiang, Tibet, its border areas that were all taken from it, it wants them back. The last one is Taiwan. Taiwan, the Japanese fought a war with China in the 1890s. Part of the settlement was, we're going to take Taiwan. The Chinese ambassador at the time said, you cannot take that part of China. If you do, it will cause unending mistrust between our two countries. It's not new that China wants Taiwan back. That's from 1895. And the KMT inherited those claims. And then the Chinese Communist Party inherited those claims. These are enduring issues, and they're not bigger. It's not that China has now said, okay, now we want more land. The Qing dynasty at its height was actually 13 million square kilometers. Now China's about 9 million square kilometers. So they gave up around 4 million square kilometers, Mongolia, etc. But whatever they have decided, now this is what they want. And those are the things they care about. And what they've explicitly said about Taiwan is, we will use force if Taiwan declares independence. So I'm going to talk about Taiwan a little bit more because I think this is super interesting and it's important to understand. But these are not new claims. These are not expansive claims. And everything else that China is doing in terms of its Belt and Road Initiative, or have you guys heard about the Belt and Road Initiative? It's an loose economic, it's more a catchphrase actually, that circles around a bunch of different provincial initiatives from China, which is just simply a bunch of economic relations around the world. Huge infrastructure demand. One of the things I think is so interesting about China, when we talk about Chinese ambitions, here's where I think it actually is a bit inconsistent. Because on the one hand, it is regular to criticize China for only being interested in business. There's no conditionality involved in this. It's not like they only want to work with uncorrupt governments or democratic governments or good governments. They'll work with anybody. And we contrast that with us, because evidently Americans sort of pretend to do that, although we'll work with anybody as well. But basically we say, we want to work with democracies. We're going to hold you up to standards. But isn't that mean they don't have ambitions? They're just doing business? I've never really understood that critique, right? How dare you not impose your moral standards on that other country and you just do business with them? That's what we do. But that's not ambitious then. That's just business. If you're saying, I don't care, I'll work with you, whatever, right? So I'm not sure that they have global reach. We were talking about it before, right? China has global economic relations. It has to manage them, but there's a difference between being a global power and then wanting domination or to change the rules or anything like that. Often the initiatives they set up are because no one else is doing it. The demand for infrastructure is incredibly deep. I'm happy to talk about it more, but the explicit issues that China says it will use force about, or that actually lists as its priorities, have remained very much regional in nature. Now, they're trans-dynastic. They have continued on. I'm going to talk about Taiwan a little bit, and then we're going to shift to the United States. Actually, I'm going to talk about the region, and then we're going to shift to the United States. Taiwan is the only place that I can see actual war breaking out as a result of U.S. China relations. North Korea could be, but it's not. That's not a China issue. That's a North Korea issue. I don't think the South China Seas are as big a deal as anyone thinks, and I'll talk about that briefly. But Taiwan's the big issue, and here's the thing about Taiwan. In America, we get involved in a bunch of semantic debates about what is Taiwan and is it Chinese and stuff like that, right? Briefly, if you don't know the Taiwan issue, here's the thing. Taiwan was always part of the frontier area of China. It was not incorporated officially into China until 1683, 400 years ago. So this was a long time ago. But the peoples that lived on that island never organized themselves into a government, a state, and then engaged in formal diplomatic relations in the tribute system with China or Japan. There's interesting contrast. Do you guys know Okinawa? You guys heard of Okinawa, right? That existed for centuries as an independent kingdom called Ryukyu. That in 1879, the Japanese invaded and conquered and incorporated into Japan, and they're never giving it back. But that had existed with formal tribute relations to China and Japan. Taiwan never existed like that. It was always a frontier area inhabited by pirates and traders and indigenous peoples. When one of the dynasties collapsed in the 17th century, they fled to the island and then tried to reconquer the mainland. It was causing such a hassle that the Qing occupied and incorporated it into Fujian province in 1683. So from 1683 till 1895, that was Chinese land, and then the Japanese took it. every government on both sides of the larger Chinese thing has said we want to have that back. So the nationalists in the 1920s and 1930s had maps that showed that Taiwan was going to be part, South China Seas. It's not simply a Communist Party thing of those maps in the South China Seas that Taiwan's a part of. When the nationalists left, they fled to Taiwan just like hundreds of years ago. And up until 1991, there was no disagreement between Taiwan and China as to what was China, because they both agreed that the KMT on Taiwan claimed we are the legitimate ruler of all China. And so do you know how they kept power in Taiwan? Is they would say, we're just one tiny little province, and there's 32 other provinces over there. But they won't vote, so we'll just pick those guys. But you guys get to vote here on this. So the opposition, of course, is going to have like one seat, and the KMT, right? It was an authoritarian government in Taiwan up until 1991 when they had their first presidential election. But they all claimed to be the legitimate ruler of all China. And the Communist Party said that's China as well. There was no disagreement between the two. The only opportunity for disagreement came with an actual election in Taiwan, where you could now get someone elected, and the party may say, we want to declare formal independence from China. So it's incredibly recent, first of all, that Taiwan's a democracy. 31 years? No, yeah, 31 years. And it's incredibly recent that anyone was worried about Taiwan declaring independence. Now, the Chinese have talked about a century of humiliation when they were being colonized and invaded and stuff like that, and Taiwan is a part of that. They only got Hong Kong back in 1997. And they only got Macau back in 1999. So for China, the century of humiliation is barely over. And Taiwan is clearly a part of it. Now, what China has said is, we will use force to keep Taiwan from declaring independence. Since 1949, when the KMT fled, there hasn't been a danger that Taiwan would do that up until recently. Now, a couple things. What China has done, originally what the Chinese did on Taiwan is they shelled and they tried to use pressure and they send rockets over, try and force Taiwan to give in. And then they sort of realized that wasn't working very well. And again, around 25 years ago, China clearly changed its strategy and said, okay, we're open for business. You're Chinese, you can come in. Since that time, about 5% of all Taiwanese have moved back. Like 1 million Taiwanese have moved back to China. There's about $200 billion worth of investment from Taiwan into China. The Taiwanese government was the one trying to limit relations. Because, of course, it is just natural that there would be deep relations, and then the more that they interact, the harder it is to separate. So the Taiwanese side didn't want direct flights, but eventually they had to give in. Before, you had to fly down to Hong Kong and then back up. And it's like 50 miles across the straits, Taiwan Straits, 100 miles. Right? So economically, these sides are deeply engaged. There's millions of tourists each year. I mean, COVID has put a break to that. What the Chinese government said to Taiwan was this: you can act independent, you can have your own government, you can have your own flag, your own money. Just don't say that you're independent and you're not part of China. What the U.S. for 40 years has said, okay, this works. We're not going to argue about who actually is the legitimate ruler of China. Just don't use force. And that has been incredibly stable. That status quo has worked. If you compare North Korea, South Korea to China-Taiwan relations, both are a result of the early Cold War and a division. Both are a communist and a whatever capitalist or Western side. One of those, nothing has essentially changed since 1945, and that's a tragedy. Nothing has essentially changed. The border is the same. You can't go, you can't call. My father was born in what is now North Korea. He was northern at the time. I've never been able to see his house because we can't go. Now that is a tragedy. The only thing that has changed in North Korea is now they have some nuclear weapons. I don't know why I'm laughing. It's not funny. But there has been no progress. You can't trade, you can't call, you can't go. You should be able to fly into Seoul, rent a car, and drive 2 hours and see where my dad was born, but you can't do it. Taiwan, on the other hand, the China-Taiwan relationship has gotten measurably better over the years. And so that's where we are today. Now, before I turn to the United States, let me turn to some discussions of the region, because often we only talk about U.S. China. But understanding where the region is going to help us as Americans understand what kind of foreign policy is reasonable or even likely. And here's one thing I'm going to tell you, it's very short, but there is no containment coalition of China. Nobody's joining us if we decide to take a hard line on China. Nobody's joining us. I'm not even sure Japan is really going to join us. The only one that might is Japan and then Australia, which is, do you know something? I looked this up. I was in Canberra once, and I thought, it's in Asia, I'll go to Seoul. And it was like a 9-hour flight. So I looked it up. Canberra to Beijing is about, I think this is a kilometer, like 6,000 kilometers. Los Angeles to Beijing is like 7,000 kilometers. Canberra, Australia is about as far from Beijing as Los Angeles. That's how far away Australia is, right? But here's why. There's a bunch of things I could tell you about how Vietnam and Korea and Philippines and everybody else views China, but here's the best evidence that nobody's cheering on the United States. A couple months ago, actually just in early August, I guess, last month, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, made a visit to Taiwan. You guys hear about that at all? It was all over the news. People went berserk, right? I think it was deeply irresponsible of her to go. I'll talk about that on the American when I talk about America. The Chinese said, don't do this, because this is America edging closer and closer to changing the status quo. Well, she left. I'll talk about the American thing later. She left, and then the next day, the Vietnamese Foreign Ministry came out and said, we want stability, and we affirm the one China policy. And the Philippines came out and said, we affirm the one China. Everybody in the region was like, nope, one China. We are not encouraging you, and we are not getting involved in that. That is not our issue. The Korean president didn't even meet her when she went to visit Korea. It was actually awkward. She showed up, and there was no official delegation to meet her at the airport. And there's pictures of the Korean president drinking beer because he was on vacation. And later on, they said it was in the interests of national, it was in the national, it was not in the national interest of Korea to meet with Pelosi. And then the next day, Korea dispatches foreign minister to China. Nobody's getting involved in this. Nobody is cheering on an America that is going to try and confront China. Every country in the region is affirming the one China policy. Indonesia, Malaysia, everybody's like, nope, not my problem. So if we start a war with China, we're doing it alone. So that's the region. Why? Why is the region that way? It is so much more peaceful now than before. It is so much richer now than before. And I'm going to talk about this in the conclusion. These countries have to live with each other. Nobody's picking up and moving away. Everyone has lived with a huge China for centuries. They know what that's like. And I'm happy to talk about the region more, but they all know. And that doesn't mean they love China. That doesn't mean they're happy with China, but they all trade with China. They all live with China. They have to. There was a Vietnamese guy when I was over there who said every Vietnamese leader has to know how to stand up to China, and every Vietnamese leader has to know how to get along with China. And if he can't do both at the same time, he doesn't deserve to lead Vietnam. They know they have to live with it. So there is not a chorus of countries that are cheering on the U.S. to take on China. That is not going to happen. And I'm happy to talk about that more. But now let me turn to sort of the United States, right? We have a fundamental question for the United States is, what type of country do we want to be? Is it really important for us to be the global leader, to be deeply involved all around the world? Or are there some things that are simply beyond our ability to control or confront or whatever else, right? Huge debate over whether we should or should not have stayed in Afghanistan, for example, right? In East Asia, we are clearly involved. We have bases in Japan that house one of the, Yokohama has a naval base. We have, I think there's like 50,000 troops that are often deployed, or military personnel deployed in Japan, about 25,000 in Korean bases. We have Guam. We used to have bases in the Philippines. The Philippines, about 30 years ago, asked us to leave, so we don't have formal bases there. But we are deeply involved around the region militarily. Economically, of course. I'll bet you could all look at your shirt. I mean, how many are made in China? The question for the United States is, should we view China as a threat and try and do something about it? Or should we actually devise a different strategy? And I will tell you now, the DC blob, I don't know if you guys heard that phrase, right? The blob, and it is a blob, trust me, meaning left and right. This is not Democrat, this is not Republican, not conservative, progressive, whatever. Almost everybody in DC, and I've watched it happen in the last 5 years, has gone from, yeah, I think we can live with China, we got to push back here, but we'll get along there. Everybody has, in lockstep, moved over and said, we tried to be nice. They're not a democracy yet. Time to contain. Let's get tough with China. I really don't know why. But that is the consensus view in the United States right now, that we need to contain China. They're trying to take over the world. We're the leader. How dare they? And I think we are going in a fundamentally wrong direction. It's not just, the Republicans under Trump. Biden has continued these policies. Now, let me give you an example. So in economics, for a number of reasons, and this is where, interesting enough, a lot of times politics, if you go too far left, you end up right, or if you go too far right, you end up left. Both both Trump and Bernie Sanders. He's a football player too. You didn't know that, right? Not just a senator. Bernie Sanders and Trump in 2016 campaigned on reducing American trade, right? More protection, more business at home, less free trade with the world. Both the far left and the far right were there, and they ended up that way. Trump won. So we, over the 4 years of Trump's presidency, put a number of tariffs and sanctions, et cetera, on Chinese high-tech companies, Huawei. We put tariffs on a lot of imports and things like that. China's not playing fair. We have to do this. We have to do that. Well, what happened was, when Biden took over, he kept almost all of those same things there. It is a bipartisan approach to China. The people in the White House right now are saying, we're not going to do what they're doing. We're going to come up with our own economic solutions. It's called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. But Biden left all of the, most of the sanctions in place, most of the tariff restrictions in place on China. It's bipartisan. We got to get tough. Well, a couple things about that. First, when we talk about U.S. policy, is it has measurably harmed American interests. The prices just went up. The companies passed along the cost of the tariffs of importing Chinese goods to the consumer. One of the studies by, I think it was U.S. Chamber of Commerce, found that like 245,000 American jobs were lost once we put more tariffs on China. The deficit briefly, our trade deficit with China, which doesn't measure anything, by the way. Those of you undergrads, right? Take some econ. It doesn't measure anything. Like if we're importing more than we're exporting, right? Because presumably we like spending our money and we're getting something good for cheaper. That's good, right? Briefly, it was like, I forget the numbers now, $400 billion trade deficit. We imported $400 billion more from China than we exported. I think that's right. And that looks like a huge number. And then it briefly went down to like 300 billion, and now it's going back up after pandemic. So A, the tariffs aren't working. We're not decoupling. And measurably, they harm the United States. Now, what happened with both Trump and Biden is this. There's a couple regional economic forums, Trans-Pacific Partnership that Trump pulled out of, the regional RCEP, which is Regional Comprehensive Economic something program policy. The Asian countries are all joining those. The United States is not engaging in those. We are not going to join them. And then what Biden did is come up with an Indo-Pacific economic framework. There's not a single substantive element of that. Now, sure, that they keep claiming that they're going to have some substance at one point, but there is nothing substantive in the IPEF. There's nothing substantive there. There's some principles. We want it to be green. We want it to be equal. So while Asia is getting more and more integrated and trading more and more with each other, we are pulling back and not offering anything concrete. I think this is a fundamentally wrong direction. Right? The thing, though, is that even trade, this is not the main reason that we're looking at China. The amount of talk about war is incredible, right? So here's the thing about war in Taiwan. It is the United States. Pelosi's visit, which is only the most visible way that the United States, Biden keeps making a gaffe where he talks about Taiwanese independence, and then someone says, no, it was a gaffe. He didn't really change the one China. Where there is a long-standing set of American policy towards Taiwan and China. It is long-standing. It has been enduring for 40 years. A series of agreements in 1970s, a Shanghai Communique with China, a Taiwan Relations Act about how we're going to deal with Taiwan. They're a little contradictory, but they basically have worked for 40 years. It's been incredibly stable. We haven't come close to war. Not really. China has gotten rich. Taiwan has gotten rich. We haven't gotten involved in a war over Taiwan. It has worked. Pelosi's visit was totally unprovoked. China didn't do anything. China didn't do anything and say, we're going to change things, we're going to invade, whatever else. Right? Taiwan didn't do anything. Pelosi, on her own, said, I'm going to go and make some performative stop in Taiwan and talk about democracy and stuff like that. We are the ones changing the status quo or trying to push for a change in the status quo. We are the ones actually having debate about should we guarantee that we're going to defend Taiwan in event of a war. I don't know why. I truly don't know why we should I say we? I am American. Why they, the policymakers, are so deeply invested in, as one of my friends where I read somewhere, like, we are in danger of loving Taiwan to death, right? Pushing them forward to get involved in a war with China. What's particularly interesting about this, and then let me try and move on. I don't want to talk too long, right? What's particularly interesting about this is that the Taiwanese are not the ones talking about declaring independence. What is so fascinating about Taiwan is this. When we talk about claims in the South China Seas, I'm not going to talk about that. I don't want to get too, but both China makes claims to a large swath of islands. A bunch of other countries also make claims to those islands. Right? China's not the only one that claims those islands. All of them are beyond UNCLOS, the law of the seas. And we say, how dare China do that? Do you know what? Do you know who makes identical claims to the South China Seas that China does? Is Taiwan. Taiwan was the first one that wrote this 9-dash line in the 1930s. The KMT government produced a map that said, this is our. It's not a Chinese Communist Party claim. It pre-exists that claim. And Taiwan, to this day, makes those same claims. And to this day, they say those are ours. Taiwan has fortified an island. Taiwan sends warships through the sea that Philippines claims. They make the identical claims. But we don't care that Taiwan does it. We just care that China does it. But my point is this. Taiwan has found an interesting way. So the leader of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, says, there's no need for us to declare independence because we already are. Right? They have found a way to survive. No one in Taiwan was saying, hey, come here, It's the United States that is threatening to change the status quo. Now, would a war occur? And I'm going to speculate a little bit here and then I'll move on to a conclusion a bit, right? China has said they will use force. China consistently treats South China Seas differently. They say, let's negotiate. Let's not use force. On Taiwan, they say, we will use force. And we believe them and Taiwan believes them. So when Pelosi visited, they did a bunch of of air drills and submarine drills around the island for about a week or so afterwards. I mean, they went berserk. To the point that normally I have a friend who's in Korea, and he was in Thailand. And when they were going to fly back, normally you just fly straight and you go right over Taiwan. But because they were doing all these military exercises, China was, they had to go all the way around the Philippines and all. It took like 2 or 3 hours more to get back to Korea. Right? So what's going to happen in case of a war is that I don't think China is going to invade the island. They will probably blockade it. And then say, what are you going to do about it? And then we will have the same question before us with China that we do with Ukraine. So I don't know. I mean, we're not willing to get involved in a war with Russia, a nuclear-armed country, over some way far away, marginally important to our national security country. As much as we may like Ukraine, Ukraine is not going to make our national security go one way or the other. And we have been incredibly careful about getting involved in an actual war with Russia. And I just wonder, have we, guys that like to play war games or whatever, going, frothing at the mouth of trying to game a U.S. China war over Taiwan. But I really wonder, are we really going to get in war with China over Taiwan? Are we really? Risk nuclear holocaust? We could. I think it is a very low probability. But I think in this case, the United States policy of urging on and doing all this performative pro-democracy stuff is in danger of backfiring. It's really in danger of backfiring and making the situation worse, not better. Whoops, worse, not better. So let me try and conclude in about 5 minutes or so. I don't want to take too long, right? First of all, thanks for listening. When the United States thinks about China, nobody, not even the worst, anti-China person, what do you call it, China pessimist, claims that China is an actual threat to the survival of the United States. Nobody thinks that. That is completely unrealistic. Nobody thinks that China harbors the dream of invading and conquering the United States. So a bunch of rowboats are going to show up on the California coast somewhere, a bunch of Chinese guys jump out, right? That's not happening. Everybody knows it. If you think about national priorities, national survival should be the first one. China is not a threat to our survival. Everybody knows that. It's not a primary existential threat. China is not even really a threat to the survival of our neighbors, our allies, Korea, Japan, Vietnam. And they know it. They're not reacting as if it were. China is at most a tertiary threat, at the margins of the territorial grid, over a bunch of rocks in the middle of water where nobody lives. And we don't even have claims on them. So I really wonder, would we fight China over territorial claims that the countries themselves are not going to fight over? Wow. That really is extending America's responsibility to protect. These countries themselves don't want to fight over the water, those rocks in the South China Seas. They don't. So are we going to do it for them? I am not sure. My point is this, and so in conclusion, right? It's easy to be pessimist. Man, for 20 years, I have had colleagues of mine darkly worried. I'm very worried about the situation in North Korea. Oh, it's very dangerous. Touch and go, right? I'm very worried about China, U.S. China Relations. Things getting worse, right? I could do that too, and all of you would think I'm hard-headed and rigorous, right? If I say, I don't think things are so bad, boy, it's just instinctive that people are like, he's naive. He's not thinking carefully enough. But I'll tell you, things can be managed. It is not inevitable that the United States and China are going to end up in a conflict or in a titanic battle for global domination. I just don't see that happening. Right? The business of East Asia over the last half century has been business, not war. When the leaders wake up and elites wake up and people wake up in Asia, they're not worried about war. They're worried about business and trade and investment and travel and things like that. And that's where East Asia is today. Our strategy, most American foreign policy since World War II, has been chin first, has been military first. We have a military, we use it. I'm not sure that's the best way. Military strength is a component of national security and a component of grand foreign policy. But when I see East Asia today, when I look at the region that I know really well, I don't see it as the primary place for war. I see it as a place for business and diplomacy. An enduring solution over the South China Seas is not going to be military. It's going to be diplomatic. An enduring solution to the Taiwan issue is going to be diplomatic. It's not going to be military. Right now, the one that is military and is frozen in sight is North and South Korea, where we're just deterring each other. So what I would like to see from the United States is much more emphasis on economic, commercial strategies and on diplomacy, and way less attempt to use our military to solve all these problems, because I don't think that we're going there. Right? So there is a solution, or there is a way forward, but it is currently not the way that either administration is doing. So I will stop there. I think I took about 50 minutes, and I'd be happy to talk about whatever you guys want. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, I guess we are a democracy, so you have a choice. You can either come down here to ask your questions, or you can enlist me as your microphone holder, and I'll come to you, whatever the audience prefers, but we definitely will welcome questions from the audience. Well, since Jim raised his hand and is still sitting down, I will come to you, but I'm going to take this back from you after you ask the question.
You are. David, excellent, thought-provoking talk. Really appreciate it. I don't disagree with the major thrust of what you're saying, and you're just thousands of years old, the idea that we can have an international boogie person to distract from home. But earlier in your talk, you made what I saw as a distinction between global reach and global dominance. And correct me if I'm wrong here. You know, global reach, you talked in an economic context, in a business context. You know, I always associated global reach economically and conducting business with some interest in influence, in control, in making sure that we had reliable business partners. So for my conceptual clarity, can you make that distinction where, global economic reach does not necessarily equate to global dominance? Thank you.
No, that's a great question, right? Like, sometimes it is, absolutely, right? Like, a lot of times trade follows the flag follows trade. We want to make sure that we have reliable sources of this, that, and the other thing, right? Part of this gets to then the question of what is China doing around the world? Because I mentioned for the Belt and Road Initiative, which is just simply a catchphrase, much of this is provincial. I mean, various different, it's not a centralized national policy, but it's a coordinating mechanism for a bunch of provinces and companies and things like that, right? So part of this is, what is the purpose of Belt and Road or Chinese economic relations? And there's a bunch of different questions out there, or different arguments out there. The first one is that there's a lot of capacity in China, and this is a way for them to sell it, because the demand for roads and infrastructure around the global south is enormous. And that's what China is willing to do. So this is in many ways a pure business proposition, right? Other times it's viewed as a way to extend and guarantee sources of goods back into China as well. So there's different things going on at the different times, right? The thing where I think you would be most interested, or where we will see, is when China sets up alternative institutions to the ones that the U.S. dominates, where they could be most likely to be changing the rules of the game, which is what we all worry, right? We like capitalism, but the Chinese like socialism with Chinese characteristics, capitalism with Chinese characteristics, right? They're going to try and do it differently. And the best example I can give of that is like the Asian Infrastructure Bank. China set up a different bank separate from the World Bank to allow loans to third world countries or global south, which is going to have different sets of conditionality and different sets of requirements than the World Bank, which generally has very high standards. And there's a lot of concern that China's changing the rules of the game, right? My thought is this on those. It might be what I see is an incredible demand and a lot of desire for movement beyond what the World Bank is doing. And so at this stage, I don't really see I see more complementary than replacing, right? In the same way that, for example, we want them to have more conditionality on who they work with in Africa. But a lot of times it's just a bank or it's just a road. And one example of this would be, we were worried that what China was doing was engaging in debt trap diplomacy. Have you guys heard of this, right? They make a bunch of loans. These countries can't pay it back. And then they grab the assets. They say, no, that's ours now. And that's exactly the way that we're worried that they're going to gain influence. You know what? There's no evidence of that. This was a term coined. What just happened, I think Financial Times had it like yesterday, is that what China has actually been doing is extending emergency loans. They made $30 billion worth of emergency loans to countries that couldn't pay back their debt to keep helping them out, which is the opposite of debt trap diplomacy. So we're still trying to see how this plays out in real time. But I think the evidence as yet is not clear that they are engaging in this for being able to grab assets or to gain political influence. Thank you. Yeah. Students.
Coming to the William Jewell section. Working my way east. Actually, this is west.
Hello. That was a great presentation. The United States has called China's treatment of the Uyghurs, specifically the forced sterilization, as genocide. And the UN recently said the possibility of crimes against humanity. Are those statements dangerous for the balance of power in China? But if so, is it the right thing to do to turn a blind eye to that?
Yeah. Shall I wait for the train? Okay, it's not that bad. Yeah, that's great, right? Here's the thing about China that I don't want to, when I'm talking about, it's not that loud, right? When I'm talking about China, this is not an overall judgment of China. This is, as an international relations, how do we get along with China? Do we fight? Do we contain? Do we engage, right? China remains, I should have said this at the start, right? China is an authoritarian government. It's a communist government, right? I've spent months there, right? And you know what? They have a great firewall. It is almost impossible. You have to have a VPN and blah, 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 right? You can't say what you know, at the height of the, the fear over Trump, all of us could say whatever we want about him, and we didn't get arrested. We didn't have our stuff taken down. There is a real difference between the domestic politics in America and the domestic politics in China. Absolutely. Right? I have a friend who's one of her friends was in Falun Gong, and they picked her up one day and she disappeared for 18 months, and then they finally let her out of jail, right? It is human rights abuses go on there, absolutely, right? It is not a free country the way we think of it. But that is different than saying, here's where I think we run into real trouble, and here's where I would agree with many realists. That is a different issue. There are many places around the world. There are many things we do I'm not proud of, okay? For us to make our foreign policies contingent on everyone being like us, and if not, we're going to try and change them, I think is a losing path. That's what we're doing in so many places right now. So yeah, whatever's going on in Xinjiang. You know what's so interesting? My parents, there was a brief opening in Xinjiang where in the early 90s, mid-90s, right after the wall fell and everything like that, and China was still in a sort of open period, you could go on the Silk Road. And my parents, my father likes to say he has Uyghur genes, right? He's just goofing, but he's from Northern Korea, so who knows, right? But they went on the Silk Road. You could go to Beijing and you could drive all the way across. They have incredible photos and stuff of the mid-90s. You can't go now. You cannot do that. It's totally closed. Right? So things have gotten worse in China, absolutely. And I wish they would get better. Where I'm not going to do, as you said, to affect the balance of power, what I do not think is wise is for us to then make that the main component of our foreign policy to China. I think then we really run into trouble. If that, yeah, good. That's a great question. Hold my toes to the fire.
Hello, Dr. Kang. Thanks for coming to Parkville. I'm Scott Kelly. I'm working at Fort Leavenworth at the Command and General Staff College.
I was trying to read the...
Yeah. Can you comment a little bit about, when you hear a lot about the conflict with China, they're challenging the international rules-based system developed after World War II. Yeah. This is terrible. It's going to lead to military conflict. Yeah. You clearly see that their aspirations are more regional. Could you comment on what you think about this conflict, about the international rules-based system, and where we are with that?
That's a great question, right? And a little bit of context. When I was growing up, realists would say it's all one system. Anarchy is constant. Nothing ever changes. What's interesting about where we are as a discipline of international relations is we now realize that there are orders and there are norms and there are rules, right? And there's ways that we do things. And so one of the ways that we worry about China is they're going to challenge the liberal international order that we set up after World War II. And that order is basically principles that we all basically agree on. Capitalism, human rights, free flow of capital, free trade. That we set up a bunch of institutions in the wake of World War II. General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, et cetera, et cetera. The World Bank, the IMF, to make sure that we could manage these things. Mostly in this case, international. Where we run into trouble is we're selective in how we engage these things, right? We treat this as a constant, right? As an enduring law of the world that the liberal international order is set up this way. But for a number of reasons, the United States doesn't engage in things that a bunch of institutions, the other countries do, right? The international crimes, the human rights, because we don't want our people to get arrested. And so we're incredibly selective about how we engage in the international order. Right? We are incredibly selective. We didn't sign the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, which is what we then claim China is violating. And I just find that amazing. Like, this is I don't want to say hypocrisy, but it's an inconsistency that I don't understand how we can do that. We're not going to be part of this because we're not going to be tied down. But how dare China not do it? How dare they not play by the rules, right? So, yes, there is debate over the international order. So my point would be, number one, it's built by us, for us, to benefit us. And then the minute it stopped working, we're backing away from free trade. And we're backing away from almost all these things, the elements, the planks of the international order. We really are. I mean, you can just write down what are the norms, what are the institutions, and do we participate or not? Some we do, some we don't. But more than that, but more than that, the question is really, to me, not that we don't believe it, but what is the alternative that China's trying to set up? And right now, I don't see nothing that I can read, nothing that I see. Do I see a vision for an alternative other than they're going to be less they're going to have less standards for who they're going to deal with, right? I don't see it. One of the things about China is often you hear this phrase, Chinese characteristics. You know what's so interesting about that? That is so clearly not a global thing. If you're not Chinese, it's not going to work. It's not a catchphrase for them. When they say capitalism with Chinese characteristics, they're saying this is what works for us. It's hard to export it if you're saying, Belize or Zimbabwe or, whatever, have capitalism with Chinese characteristics. That is so clearly internally focused. So I don't see yet the alternative, what they see there. I will say one thing. I do not think China has any goal of recreating the tributary system of 500 years ago. There's no way. They don't see it. Nobody else sees it, right? So this is not, in the region, they're going to deal with these countries, but I don't see them trying to reach back to a totally different order. And I don't see yet an alternative like this is what it should be. In many ways, they've gotten rich by playing by the rules. They're just trying to tweak them a little bit, is the way I view it. So, yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much. There's so many things about Asia I don't understand. Your presentation helped fill in some really important dynamics. I keep hearing a counter argument that goes like this. Personalities matter, and Xi Jinping is different.
Yeah.
That he is a focal point of humiliation and outrage, and he is changing the agenda, and you can tell because of a series of actions. In 2015, he committed to President Obama that he would not militarize South China Seas. He was lying. In 2015, he committed that they would no longer use Chinese espionage systems for economic purposes. He was lying. In 2017, they opened concentration camps in Xinjiang and may have started to commit genocide. In 2020, he rips up the settlement regarding Hong Kong 20 years prematurely. When you put the pattern together, the argument is, this is a guy who is making dangerous decisions, and it's not simply about coming up with living with stuff together. Yeah. It's focused on power and assertion.
Great, right? I'm glad we're talking about Xi Jinping because he's truly an interesting guy, right? There's only three major, they're almost like the constitution of the Communist Party. There's three major policy platforms that the Communist Party has adopted over its entire history. The first one was in 1949, anointing Mao as the first great leader. The second one, I think, was in wasn't 78, it was Deng Xiaoping. And then the third one was at the last, in 2020, Xi Jinping. He is the third great leader of the Chinese Communist Party. And he has changed the rules domestically. There had been, for a long time, ever since Deng Xiaoping, then there had been basically a rule or a norm that you would do 2 5-year terms, then you're out. And he's clearly blown way past that. He's going on. In fact, it's going to come up in October, I think, that he will be reaffirmed for a third term as the general secretary of the party, right? Which is, unprecedented. So in many ways, he has consolidated power. There is way more pressure on people in China to join the party now. So I have friends who are lawyers in Beijing who could care less, but they're being pressured to join the Communist Party now, or else their jobs might be in trouble. So there's a lot of domestic stuff going on, right? Part of what the question is how much of that is external and how much of that is internal. So part of the questioning is, one, South China Seas, and I'll talk about it a little bit, right? The second one would then be, has he sped up the timetable for getting Taiwan back? Which I don't think he has. But there's a lot of speculation that this is the kind of stuff he's going to do, right? So on the South China Seas, the militarization of the South China Seas began in 1974 when Vietnam built an airfield. Taiwan has the largest, Ituaba, which is about 1,000 kilometers away. It's the largest island that is militarized. Vietnam has actually reclaimed and occupied the largest number of islets, whatever you want to call it. Right? China is one of the last ones to start militarizing. After every other country has an airfield. Every other country has reclaimed land. China is one of the last ones to do it. And in typical Chinese fashion, of course, when they decided to reclaim land, they reclaimed more land than anybody else, right? And my point is this, that issue is a multilateral issue. If nobody else were doing it, then we could blame China for militarizing the islands. But Vietnam is putting, very small, but they're putting arms there and things like that. I'll tell you an interesting story about that in a minute. The Philippines has that destroyer that they run aground on their reef. So if no one else was doing it and China was, it would be easy to say they're the ones at fault. But in many ways, Taiwan, as I said, is doing the same thing. So the real question to me is not how dare China do it. It's what is the solution? Because if the democracies can't do it, if Taiwan has not resolved those debates with Japan, they make the same claims to the islands. It's hard to then say it's all China's fault that these are not solved yet. There is a discussion of a code of conduct. It's going incredibly slowly. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, they were supposed to have it done about a year ago. A code of conduct for how we're going to go. All these countries are trying to get China to say we'll never use force. They are holding off. So it's an incredibly complex situation. But I see it as being much more complicated than simply just China. And let me give you another example about that, right? Japan has territorial disputes with every single country it could have territorial disputes with. The Kurils Islands with Russia, they still haven't resolved those. North and South Korea don't agree on very much, but they both agree that those Dokdo Islands are Korean and not Japanese. And then both China and Taiwan agree that the East China Sea is Chinese in some way, right? And Japan hasn't resolved them. To me, this is a regional issue. And it's a regional issue that arrives for the same time period that we talked about that started in the 1870s, 1880s, when everybody was grabbing land. And it's even worse than that because, do you know the Solomon Islands, right? I was just doing a conference where I don't know this stuff, but I wanted someone to write a paper on the Pacific Island mandates because there are Solomon Islands, Fiji, that are semi-sovereign, that we basically control, and we fought with China, not China, it was Japan, over who's going to control what. And so none of them are actually sovereign. Guam, they're sort of protectorates or free associations or whatever else. There's a ton of things that are not resolved in this, all from that same time period. And so, yeah, China's a central player in it, but it's not the only one. And in fact, one of my students just wrote a book pointing out that when ASEAN all agrees, China tends to go along. It's that when they don't agree, when China pushes. So yeah, China's a big bully. But everybody else can't agree on what to do either. And that makes the situation that much more complicated. So in some ways, yeah, I think he is clearly planning to hold power domestically for as long as possible. Internationally, I'm not so sure that the vision is there for more than this is what we already had, and we're going to try and figure out how to deal with it.
Please join me in thanking our 30th annual Dr. Jersey Hauptmann Distinguished Guest Lecturer, Dr. David Kang.
Thank you.
Since I know his chauffeur, he may hang for a few minutes to answer your questions that you may have. We will be back for the 31st Hauptmann Lecture next year. If my brain is working correctly, we're due to do something on democracy. And what's interesting is, who knows what we're going to be talking about this time next year. The world has been changing rapidly. Thank you all for being here. We will be archiving this on our YouTube channel, fingers crossed, so it'll be available for you to share with your friends, people who weren't here. And thank you to everybody who was streaming online. We heard from a lot of people who wanted to see this. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Kang. Everybody have a good evening.